Good morning, I'm Gary DeWaal, and this is Bridging the Week for June 12th to 16th, and today is June 19th, 2017. The European Commission proposed a protectionist regime for the oversight of third country regulated clearinghouses, while the U.S. Department of Treasury recommended mostly keeping the Volcker rule as is, but simplifying the definition of proprietary trading and adding increased flexibility for authorized market-making activity. Summer in the Northern Hemisphere begins this week, so I can get outside and work in an unhealthy tan. Let's get started. The European Commission proposed measures that would substantially amend its process for the approval of clearinghouses, so-called CCPs, operating outside the European Union that provide services in the EU. Today, CCPs subject to third country regulatory oversight can provide their services after the regulatory and supervisory regime that they are subject to is recognized as equivalent by the European Securities and Markets Authority. Last week, the EC proposed that non-systematically important third country CCPs continue to operate under the same equivalency regime going forward. However, CCPs determined to be systematically important by ESMA would be subject to stricter requirements, including prudential requirements for EU CCPs, for example, capital requirements and business conduct rules, any additional requirements established by the EU central banks, and obligations to provide ESMA with certain information and to submit to on-site examinations. These requirements are in addition to those imposed by a CCP's home regulator. Finally, if a CCP is determined by ESMA in agreement with a relevant EU central bank as quote-unquote substantially systematically important, the CCP might be required to locate in the EU and be authorized by the appropriate EU member state regulator. A CCP may be designated as substantially systematically important if, quote, the additional requirements for systematically important CCPs are insufficient to mitigate the potential risk, end of quote. Sounds quite arbitrary. Brexit? Protectionism? The U.S. Department of Treasury proposed substantial amendments to the Volcker rule and made other recommendations regarding the regulation of banks and credit unions in response to President Donald Trump's core principles for the federal regulation of the U.S. financial system issued earlier this year. Although the Department of Treasury expressed its continued support for the principle that banks with access to the federal safety nets, for example, FDIC insurance and the Federal Reserve discount window, should not be permitted to engage in speculative trading for their own account, Treasury indicated that, quote, in its design and implementation of the Volcker rule has far overshot the mark. According to Treasury, the Volcker rule's definition of proprietary trading should be simplified by eliminating the subjective, quote, purpose test, end of quote, to determine whether a trade is principally for the purpose of short-term resale and thus prohibited, and by addressing increased flexibility for market-making activity. Treasury also recommended that Congress take measures to reduce fragmentation, overlap, and duplication in the U.S. regulatory structure. This could include, said Treasury, quote, consolidating regulators with similar missions and more clearly defining regulatory mandates, end of quote. Additionally, Treasury recommended that a number of bank regulations implementing Dodd-Frank should be reconsidered to mitigate their negative impact on market liquidity, particularly the supplementary leverage ratio and the enhanced supplementary leverage ratio. Among other things, said Treasury, measures of total exposure in such calculations should exclude initial margin for centrally cleared derivatives. Adoption of such relief would help make futures commission merchant activity more attractive to banks. Treasury's recommendations were in a report addressing the depository system, including banks and credit unions. Treasury will also issue reports addressing capital markets, including debt, commodities, and derivatives markets, and central clearing. And finally, on May 4th, New York City enacted a local law barring employers from asking about prospective employees' salary history, including benefits or other compensation, or conducting an investigative search into public records or reports for the purpose of obtaining an applicant's salary history. In addition, if an employer knows of an applicant's past compensation, New York City's new law prohibits it from relying on that information when determining future compensation. According to a press release issued by New York City at the time, the new law endeavors to ensure, quote, equal pay for equal work, end of quote. According to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, quote, the simple fact is that women and people of color are frequently paid less for the same work as their white male counterparts, end of quote. The new law does not prohibit employers from asking applicants for quote-unquote objective measures of an applicant's productivity, including information related to sales, revenue, or other production reports. The New York City Commission on Human Rights is empowered to fine employers with civil penalties of up to $250,000 for willful and malicious violations of the law, and can also award compensatory damages. The new law becomes effective on October 31st. Well, that's it for this week's edition of Bridging the Week. As always, there's more information in each article and more articles on the article version of Bridging the Week on the website. Check it out. I'm Gary DeWaal. Have a great week, and until the next edition of Bridging the Week, ciao.